Hey everyone, so I come to you on Tag Tuesday for once with a tag that I'm actually posting on Tuesday. But anyway, this is the Classics book tag, and it's a tag that I've known about for a long time and which it seems like everyone has done, so I'm not going to tag anyone at the end, but it's a tag that's right up my alley because I read a lot of classics. I think I was looking at the number of the books that I've read this year, and I think I counted that like 2/3 of the 80 books that I've read this year are all classics. So I'm a big reader of classics, and so this is kind of the perfect tag for me. So yeah, I thought I would do it, and I've been seeing a couple of booktubers in my radar do it. Just One Reader did it, and Book Olive did it. So I thought that I would just jump in and do it finally as well. I've been tagged in a few things, so I will get around to the tags that I've actually been tagged in at some point, but I just thought I would do this tag for fun. So the first question is an overhyped classic that you really didn't like. For me, that is The Confessions by St. Augustine. I read it in this translation by Peter Constantine. It was a good translation with a good introduction, very readable translation. However, the book itself just really was underwhelming. I found some of the more philosophical parts that had a big effect on sort of Western thought and on the Catholic Church and such very interesting. And there's one passage in particular that I return to periodically where Augustine makes this argument that evil doesn't exist. It's very weird, and I still haven't been able to wrap my head around it, but I still return to some of those passages that are a bit more philosophical. But as a memoir, I just thought that this was dull. Even at parts where that should have been really powerful, like when St. Augustine described his mother's death, I was just really kind of bored. And so, yeah, I'm just surprised to hear this held up as, one of the greatest memoirs ever written, because I didn't agree. So, yeah. Anyway, that is an overhyped classic. Number 2 is your favorite time period to read about. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I read a lot of ancient classics, and I love reading about the ancient world more and more. I love reading about the history of the ancient world, but I think that the period that holds my attention the most, that I am most intrigued by and read the most books from, at least in terms of classics, is between 1900 and the Second World War, especially in the interwar period, but also more generally just between 1900 and 1950. Just because I think, that was the era of modernism, literary modernism, and I find it very interesting the way that writers dealt with the psychological effects of the First World War, and how a lot of what they wrote sort of seemed to anticipate what would happen in the Second World War. And so I just find it a very intriguing period of transition from the 19th century to the late 20th century, and arguably the 21st century, which we of course now live in. And so I'm very intrigued by that time period, so I would say that. Number 3 is your favorite fairy tale. I am not that interested in fairy tales, so I don't really have an answer for this one. But number 4 is the classic you're most embarrassed not to have read. And I'm not really embarrassed not to have read certain classics. I just have a list of classics that I want to get to, and most of which I haven't gotten to because there are a lot of them. And so I'm not exactly embarrassed not to have read any classics. But one classic that it is strange I haven't gotten to yet is On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, which has also a Latin title, De Rerum Natura. And this is an ancient Roman epic poem, and it's sort of philosophical. As I understand it, I obviously haven't read it yet, so I don't quite know, but as I understand it, puts forth a lot of the main ideas from Stoicism, but also Epicureanism, but also other philosophies that were popular in the Roman world. But yeah, so it's like this philosophical epic poem, and it just, the reason it's weird that I haven't read it yet is because, for one thing, it's been on my TBR for donkey's years, but the other reason that it's weird that I haven't read it yet is because it just ticks a lot of boxes for my tastes. It's a very Lukács book. We have ancient Rome, we have an ancient Roman classic, we have an epic poem, and we have philosophy, and so it just sounds right up my alley. But thankfully, I am actually going to be finally getting to this in November because I'm going to be buddy reading it with Jason Harrigan. So anyway, I'm looking forward to finally getting to that one. Number 5 is 5 classics you would like to read soon. Well, I did just sort of say that I'm going to be reading The Nature of Things soon, but I'll name 5 more. The first one, and again, you know, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that I am not big on, like, hard TBRs, so this doesn't mean that I'm going to be reading and reviewing these books soon, but they've been on my mind. The first one is Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is obviously huge, but which sounds like a Lukács book. It sounds really ambitious and sprawling with really profound themes, and yeah, that sort of stuff is just my jam. So yeah, and I've just been thinking about it also because of Victober next month. But yeah, the second one is My Antonia by Willa Cather, and the reason that this has been on my mind is just because I've started to read and get into Willa Cather's work this year. I've read 2 novels by her earlier in the year, The Song of the Lark and Death Comes for the Archbishop, and liked them both a lot. I like Willa Cather's writing. She writes a lot about the American West, which is, you know, an area of the world that I'm very interested in. And I like the characters that she portrays in her stories. So yeah, this is supposed to be one of her major works, so I'm excited to get that one. The third one is Dr. Faustus by, sorry for the glare, by Thomas Mann. And this is his kind of modernist take on the Faust legend. And in this rendition of the story, Faust is imagined as a composer, and he's not named Faust. He's named Adrian Leverkühn. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but he's a composer, and he basically gains the ability to compose brilliant music at the cost of basically losing his mind due to syphilis. And it sounds fascinating. I love Thomas Mann's writing. I've only read a little bit of his work, but what I have read I've loved. I love classical music, and from what I've heard, there's a lot of classical music talk in this novel, which will undoubtedly be my jam. And I'm very intrigued by the Faust legend as well. And I've read a few other obviously Christopher Marlowe and Goethe's renditions, so I'm sort of interested to see what Thomas Mann makes of the legend. So yeah. And the last 2 are both from the ancient world. So the first is The Civil War by Julius Caesar. This is his sort of memoir, sort of propaganda piece about the campaign that he waged against the Roman Republic. It really wasn't a civil war, as the title of this book would suggest. But it's just an account of his campaign that he wrote about half of this, and then others of his generals wrote the rest of the story because Caesar didn't finish it. And I want to read this in particular because last year I read Julius Caesar's memoir about the Gallic Wars, his campaigns against the Gauls in what is now France, and I found that to be a very interesting reading experience. The war with Gaul was a very gripping reading experience, a very fast-paced, enjoyable narrative, but what made it particularly interesting was to sort of read between the lines and see the things that Caesar wasn't saying, because, you know, he was committing essentially war crimes in the war with Gaul, and in this book he's basically describing him, you know, intentionally taking down the Roman Republic. So, but he doesn't portray them that way, right? So you have to read between the lines, and so I find it interesting in that sense, and sort of in the way of getting an insight into Caesar by reading his writing and reading it sort of with a critical eye. But also, again, these are just like gripping narratives, so they are actually reasonably enjoyable to read if you can sort of step away from how vile the human being behind it is. So anyway, I want to read that. And then the last one is probably the most obscure classic I'm going to talk about here, and it's The Early History of Rome by Polybius. And so Polybius was a Greek writer, but he wrote this big book that's just called the Histories, which was a history of the Roman Empire, and this is only a fraction of it that survives, but this is most of what survives from the ancient world in this Penguin Classic. And this book has in it the story of the 3 Punic Wars, and what got me interested in reading Polybius in particular is the fact that Livy used him as a source to a great degree for his account of the Second Punic War and the war with Hannibal and that book that I just talked about the other day. And so I got interested in reading this, and I'm also just more generally interested in learning more about Roman history, so I want to read this. So anyway, yeah. So next, number 6 is your favorite modern book or series based on a classic. I don't really read those kinds of books, actually, so I don't have a real answer, but I thought I would give a sort of cheat answer and just put Ulysses by James Joyce, which is, you know, a sort of reimagining of Homer's Odyssey into 20th century Dublin. And I read this at the beginning of the year, and I really, really liked it. I'm probably not the Ulysses super fan that some people are, but I found parts of some of the writing just gorgeous. I found the ideas behind it really interesting, and I'm just sort of intrigued by it on a sort of intellectual level and all the thought that James Joyce put into it, all the references he put into it and everything. So I did like it a lot, and yeah, so I thought this was a bit of a cheat answer because this isn't really what the question's asking about, but I wanted some sort of answer. So, but number 7 is your favorite movie version or TV series based on a classic. This is really stretching the definition of a classic, but I'm gonna say the Frank Herbert's Dune that was broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel. It was directed by John Harrison. I believe it's like 6 hours long or something like that. And yeah, I think Dune, you know, it was published in the 1960s. So, like, to call it a classic in the same way that you call The Odyssey a classic or that you call, you know, Middlemarch a classic, it is a little strange. But, I mean, I do think it has taken on a status as a modern classic, especially in the genre of science fiction. So, anyway, but this is my favorite. This came to mind as the adaptation of a classic that I love the most. I wish it were more popular. I wish Dune fans were not as dismissive of it, because I think it succeeds on a lot of different levels. Its art direction, its costumes are great, its acting is really good, its script is really nice, the special effects haven't exactly aged super well, but they are quite good. Yeah, and it's also quite faithful to the story, and I like that a lot. And I think it's much better than the David Lynch adaptation, which was just kind of bonkers, and I feel like was a lot more David Lynch than it was Frank Herbert, even though Frank Herbert sort of sanctioned that adaptation. But anyway, yeah, so I love this adaptation. If you're a fan of Dune and you have dismissed this adaptation and not seen it because other fans have dismissed it, then I would recommend you watch it, because I think you'll be surprised. And there was also the follow-up on the Sci-Fi Channel, Children of Dune, which is actually an adaptation of Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, which is the second and third books in the series. And this is also really good. It has James McAvoy. It's, yeah, I love this one as well. Although I have watched this a lot more than this, so I need to rewatch this. But anyway, yeah. Okay, sorry, I spent a lot of time talking about Dune. Alright, number 8, worst classic to movie adaptation. So, this was hard for me, because if an adaptation of a classic is bad, I tend to just forget about it, so I had no real way of coming up with a proper answer, but I thought that I would go with Troy, which is a film from 2004, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, and this is ostensibly an adaptation of Homer's Iliad, and really it just kind of takes the story of the Iliad and the Quintus of Smyrna's post-America, which tells the rest of the story of the Trojan War, and kind of strips it of any subtlety and strips it of the gods as well. The gods are prominent characters in the Iliad and in all of Homer, but they don't appear in this, and just kind of turns the story of the Iliad into an action flick, kind of romantic action flick. And as a romantic action flick, I actually happen to like it, which is why I own it. But as an adaptation of the Iliad, it really is kind of a travesty. It's really not an adaptation, it's just, again, an action flick about a mythologized version of a war that may or may not have happened. So, yeah, I would go with that, even though I do like this movie, but I realize that it has a lot of detractors, and that's probably, like with the Dune, probably a minority opinion. But, anyway, number 9... favorite editions you'd like to collect more classics from. I am gonna go with the Oxford World Classics series. I really like the white spines in contrast to the black Penguin Classic spines. I like the material. I like the feel of the covers, the material that it's made out of. I like the paper that is used to make them. I like the way that the writing is formatted on the page more than in Penguin Classics. And I've had more success with the critical apparatus that appear in the Oxford series than in the Penguin series. I just find that the introductions in the Oxfords and the notes tend to be very helpful and explanatory and insightful and enjoyable on their own. And and the only major drawback from them is that the spines can tend to be a little delicate on these, which they aren't in the Penguins. And that is regrettable, but I think all it takes is just being a little bit careful when you read these. But yeah, definitely I would say the Oxfords. Alright, and then number 10 is an underhyped classic that you'd recommend to everyone. Now, recommending any book to everyone is always a dubious process, because, tastes differ. However, a lesser-known classic that I do think that a lot of people would love, I don't know if I can go so far as this question asks me to and say that everyone would love it, but still, I think everyone would at least enjoy it and appreciate it. And it's Haji Murad by Leo Tolstoy, which is the last book that he published before he died. I believe it was published in 1910 or 1912, and it's about a Chechnyan warlord named Haji Murad, who formerly was fighting against the Russian invaders of Chechnya, but has defected to the Russian side from the Chechnyan side because of a personal vendetta against another Chechnyan warlord. And it's just his story about this sort of tense relationship that he has with the Russians. It's a fascinating and gripping story. It has just some of the most brilliant characterizations ever, even characters who appear for only 1 or 2 pages are, fully human immediately. Tolstoy is that good at creating real, believable human characters. And I just think that anyone who read this couldn't fail at seeing that. So, I would recommend this. And, I just don't hear as many people talk about this book as much as War and Peace and Anna Karenina and the Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I totally think this stands up to those. I haven't read War and Peace, but I think it stands up to Anna Karenina and Death of Ivan Ilyich, certainly. So anyway, so Haji Murad by Leo Tolstoy, that is the classics book tag. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know if you have any thoughts, and if you want to do the tag, then just consider yourself tagged by me. And anyway, I'll let you all go, and have a nice day. Bye, guys.